It is. It's 80 on that.
Yeah, I think
This thing is already coming logically.
what?
Camera.
Is what? Block.
Like it's already.
Just
Alright. You're saying it's clear at all and she just.
okay, I didn't listen to that. Just started it. But she said she must be following along. She said she was there, and I was like,
Oh,
where?
in the program it says B308. Ah,
B3.
which session is this?
It's English because
What session?
she will
Oh, Jesus.
B08. I'm gonna check this picture for me.
This you go. That's what I'm saying. What version of the program are you looking at? This is something of after. That's right. So they sent a final version of the program. Okay, so it's here. Okay, whichever copy you have. The one, there's an electronic version that has different.
Yeah.
So they sent 1 2 days for the final final housekeeping, and then they attach that program, and that program has this. So it says this is a kind of accounts for. And we spell flu, but some of the lessons are still. Yeah, we're AH. Yeah. In yeah, very front data.
Okay.
I'm trying to send that.
Can we sit here? I don't know. You want us to move it? Of course we can. We can do what we want.
Yeah, like.
Okay, you want to move the table and stuff?
Move it. Come let's try it. You want this? Oh,
Maybe.
Even just trying to get it all, yeah.
That might be easier to. It's one large file.
If you have a flash, you also need.
I don't have much. Do you? Oh. I didn't know. I mean. Yeah. I love those ones. Yeah.
Bring that.
Oh, I should reach out. That's great. How was your parent?
Yeah.
Yes, we started to. Yeah. Oh, you're so funny.
Sorry. Oh, that's fine. Oh, that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
See? University of Toronto.
Oh, awesome. Nice. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's it, yeah. Yes, I know just told me you're the active education.
Yes.
Yes, how would you program or how? Okay. Guys, keep the connections going. That's right. No, I didn't. You know, when did that happen? Oh, okay, I'm Canada. Just go to the circle. So should pleasure meeting you. So much. Take care.
Yeah, let me give you, thank you so much for such a warm welcome.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye. Okay. That's so great.
Back up. Okay.
We love so
And then. Okay, I'll hold it.
Really?
Where are you? What's there? It's a step.
I, because things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
Very beautiful.
How did your session go?
And
You had
my
a great
session
time?
of them, and it was kids, with the young people.
Okay.
They just started a special education program 2
Lovely.
years ago. So the timing of this visit is like,
Perfect.
and they do, kids were circled. Yeah. For me, but I asked them, like,
Yeah.
so it was worth it.
That's good.
Didn't have like saying, going to look like they're here for the AC.
You know, she.
No, she legitimately can't.
Because one of the reason why you have it is whatever program you and Crystal have is I think the other version. They sent an updated version. Yeah.
I was like, I don't know. Let me that. Yes. Got it.
Oh, okay. They have some-
So you're gonna sit. Elbow. Saeed, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Hi.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Nanray, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Barely. You're breaking up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
We're just loading the slides and then we're about to get started.
Yes, you should. You don't have to, no, you don't have to share with me. You just displayed it. It's okay, I left it because you don't have to share it today. Okay, well, you need to wipe this down altogether.
I was gonna get wipes.
Nanray, can you change your name?
They have to make them co-hosts. Can you make the two co-hosts?
I don't see myself. Am I the one with your name?
Yeah, you're my name, so you can change it to your own name.
Okay.
The camera's here. The camera is here.
The camera is right there. But we need to share the screen for people here. They're not seeing it.
The audience?
The slides. I meant don't share it with the Zoom.
Okay.
Hello.
The instructions won't be able to see it. So they're not.
Yes. Please come closer. Why are you so far away? Yes, now. Why are you so far away? We're a bit of a small group. Saeed and Nanray. They actually changed our room number on us, so I hope the people are not at 308. Can you hear me?
Oh, that's a good point.
So we'll get started anyway. Hopefully we have a very generative conversation. Okay, so it's really wonderful to have you all here. I'm Crystal Strong from Rutgers University and the Move Activist Archive. And our panel is entitled Africana Counter Archives, Reclaiming African Diasporic Histories, Remapping the Project of African and Africana Studies. And the core question and thread that we will be discussing on our panel today is how African diasporic community knowledge systems and memory practice have been harnessed to create counter archives that reflect diverse experiences and radical histories that have been historically suppressed. So we will start off, if you can go to the next slide, the slide before that. We will hand it off to Funke.
Okay. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Funke Alade-Jabi from the University of Toronto. And a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today, or the elements of the evidence that I'm going to present today, are part of a larger research project which seeks to map out Black populations in Canada, particularly African continental-born African populations and Caribbean student-born populations who came and were inflecting in Canadian landscape, particularly in higher education spaces. So that's the larger project. But today I'm going to be centering it on Nigerian students specifically. And in this conversation, I really want to talk about how post-World War II literature that has been written on student migration to Canada has largely focused on the United Kingdom or the United States, and little engagement has been had around the Canadian context and the contributions of Canada specifically. It's only now that we're seeing we have more popular culture songs like We Go Canada, this vision of Canada in a particular way, particularly in the Nigerian psyche, but I'm tracking a longer historical trajectory of where some of that comes from. So as a result, then I really want to think about why this idea of mobility and access, particularly in the Canadian context, is important for us to understand why Nigerian students gravitated to Canada in the first place. And as a result of that, I really want to argue around education and higher education became a key battleground for Cold War politics in the 1950s and 1960s, but it also became an important landscape by which we can understand elements and ideas of Black resistance, Black activism on a transnational and global scale. So as a result, I think part of this idea is to also understand that Nigerian students seized scholarship opportunities, seized access to all of these funding and aid and grant programs, specifically to find themselves in Canada for all kinds of reasons. And I want to have a larger conversation around why they did that. Scholars in the Nigerian context have discussed this as Nigerian transatlantic mobilities, this idea that Nigerians strategically positioned themselves or understood Canada as a place not just of opportunity, but as a place by which they could contribute in various ways. So all of this is to think about the historical context of that. And one of the images I've used here in this slide particularly talks about these Nigerian students in the 1960s at the University of Waterloo, and they're meeting with Douglas Wright, who is was the first kind of dean of engineering there. And what he actually does is really they're using Nigerian students as a way to present the university as modern, as a way to present the university as progressive in their approach to racial diversity. And there's a reason why they do that. So as a result of this, I'm really having a cross-cultural conversation that it wasn't just about Nigerian students being recipients of aid, scholarships, of education, that it actually was Nigerian students who deeply, deeply educated the Canadian landscape around decolonial perspectives, anti-colonial perspectives, and in anti-Black racism more broadly. So to answer this question, next slide, please. So to answer this question then around archives and how we might imagine and rethink archival practices, I really want us to think about the context of how we imagine Black communities, particularly African communities. In the Canadian context, there has been an overwhelming presentation of Black students as largely from the Caribbean, and also, or maybe if they do at all, talk about them as Canadian-born Black populations. It's only in more recent discussions 1980s, 1990s, that there's been an increasing conversation of an African persona. And I'm trying to say that there's a larger tracking of that. So as a result, then a lot of the archival work that I look at seeks to engage in oral testimonies, newspaper reports, student newsletters, and a significant intervention that I think I'm making in the work is actually to also analyze student yearbooks. So student yearbooks have these interesting blurbs about how students were talking. They have poetry, they have all kinds of reflections of the way in which young people and students in the post-secondary space were thinking about themselves and thinking about the ways that they were engaging in the university. So you'll see a lot of times Nigerian students are writing little blurbs about their encounters with snow, their encounters with new people, dating in integrated dance halls, right? All of the, which is really fascinating to think about if you're a historian like me that's interested in that kind of stuff. In addition to that, I think it's also important to understand that these yearbooks also reflected a really particular white Canadian lens by which these students were always perpetually constructed as the foreign other, right? And in a particular way, I think it's important because that discussion of the other changes over time and space. In the 1950s and 1960s, when Canada is bidding for Cold War access, it really invites international students as a way to learn about Canadian life, but also as a way for Canada to insert itself in Nigeria. But by the time we get to the 1970s and 1980s, that discourse changes significantly. And there is an anxiety around international students as being and taking up space for Canadian-born population. So there's this tension that exists there. So I think yearbooks like the one that I featured here offer a different way, or yearbook images, yearbook blurbs offer a different way for us to think about Nigerian presence in Canada. Specifically, these yearbooks not only quantify the number of Africans and particularly Nigerian students who were in Canada, but they also help us to see how Nigerian students contributed to these higher education structures. What were the things that they were talking about? What were the ideas and context around activism, Pan-Africanism that so many of them were part of? If we think, for example, about Ted Agulefos, who was pictured in this slide, who was born in 1926 in Nigeria, Ogidi, Nigeria specifically, he becomes part of the first wave at the University of Saskatchewan of Black students into the medical school there. And he attended 3 universities, Dalhousie University as well as Queen's University. And he also joins the Canadian Armed Forces, but also participates in the Biafran War. And he goes back and forth in really, really fascinating ways that I think is important for us to understand. So it's not just that these Nigerian students were coming to Canada and staying, they often had visions of coming back and vice versa. There was this traversing of geographies that became really important. Next slide, please. Another important archival practice that is worth really considering in this idea and conversation is that a lot of times Nigerian students more broadly and African students were often considered as not contributing to the history of higher learning in Canada. And I'm making a different argument that actually they had significant role to play in student activism of the period, but particularly also in Black activism and Pan-African movements of the period. So if we think, for example, about Nwafor, who was elected into the International Students Organization at McGill in the 1960s, and 1965, particularly at McGill University, is a really, really important moment in terms of like Black activism. So Peter gets elected, of course, in 1965, but he's also part of the earliest African Student Association at the university. They're engaging in all kinds of decolonial conversations around Rhodesia, South Africa, and the list goes on and on. So they're really also engaging in Pan-Africanist discourses. And the thing that I wanted to argue here is that they also create the first inflections of Black studies courses in Canada. They also create some of the earliest inflections of African studies in Canada, setting the foundation for what would eventually become not yet a Black Studies program, because Canada doesn't have that. We can talk about why, but the earliest renderings of this discourse. So part of this is to think about when Nigerian students were there and also why and the kinds of things they were talking about. And my final conversation, next slide, please, is really about the hidden curriculum. By the time we moved into the 1970s, 1980s, for example, Canadian higher educational institutions start to redefine international students as permanent migrants. And this is really, really important for what eventually happens to students who try to move in. So no longer could you, for example, submit for permanent residencies. No longer could you transition to become a citizen. It became incredibly difficult to do by the mid to late 1970s. And a lot of this is actually in response to the Black student activism that happened in the late 1960s, largely from Caribbean and African students. And so this is an interesting thing that happens as a result of that. But I think also my archival practice asks us to also engage in different ways of reading the archives. To this end, I use written correspondence from students who also weren't accepted into the program to discuss the way in which racialization happened in Canadian institutions, to not only create a system by which discrimination was enacted, but also to talk about the goals that these students had for coming, right? So this written correspondence by Kenny talks about, he's writing to the foreign student advisor and asking, do you know any scholarship programs, any aid programs? I'm a student who's finishing, here are the things that I'm really interested in. And what's really fascinating about these kinds of archival renderings are that they often come with little notes on the side. You can see that little red letter. And it says, Carol, this is the one I called you about. And then I looked up, I couldn't find who Carol was, but I found out who Shirley was, and she was the Dean of Nursing at the time, the School of Nursing and the Faculty of Nursing at the time. And so there are these also a way that you can read these archival spaces as a remapping of like these kind of like side notes around who was communicating and talking to these students when Nigerian students became more foreign and international. Thank you. And so this is all part of that. The corresponding letter from the faculty administrator actually said, sorry, we don't have any scholarship aid programs for you. And in fact, you would be better suited for going to a Nigerian institution that could better fit African ideals, right? So you can see also the way in which foreignness, anti-Blackness becomes further entrenched in a hidden curriculum in Canada. So all of this is to say the archival spaces offer really interesting ways to read and understand Nigerian aspirations, goals, and also the way in which Nigerian students created a platform and a foundation for Black activism and Pan-Africanism in Canada more broadly. So I'm not necessarily asking you or asking the question about a reimagining of the archive, but rather a rereading of what particular local university archives, all of these spaces can tell us, in addition to oral stories and narratives that really inflect that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. Perfect. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Mildred.
Yes.
And I'll have.
And thank you so much. So how do I go?
You don't have to do anything.
Oh,
Just talk.
okay. All right, so the next slide. No, how do I go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, next slide. Thank you. All right. Hello, I'm Dr. Mildred Boveda, and I am an associate professor of special education at Penn State University, which is situated in the United States. While 56% of public school students in the United States are children of color, approximately 80% of public school teachers are white women. So the titular question of my presentation asks, how did a Black feminist claiming decolonial ethics come into an overwhelmingly white field like special education? And do you guys know anything about special education? So you know a little. So yes, special education, especially in the United States, is coming from a very positivistic framework. So decolonial thought, Black feminism, those types of things are typically not what you find in my field. So how did I end up in a field like this? Next. All right. So as an academic and teacher educator practicing in the United States, my intersectional social cultural identities are entangled with the remembered histories of another country that emerged from the first colony in the Americas. And that country was also the site of the first indigenous devastations in the so-called New World. And on those lands were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, first to revolt against Western European subjugation. So to retrace and map the path that led to my career as an academic and the sensibilities I currently apply in my research and inquiry during the 21st century, I must begin by introducing Mommy. Next slide, please. Antelia Cambero, that was my mom, okay? My favorite person in the world, and you'll see why. She's the answer to everything. She's the source. So she was born in the Dominican Republic, and she was born in the 1930s. She and my father, they started their family in the 1960s, which was also the decade that all of my older siblings were born, all of them. I was born in the 1980s. So in addition to my status as the generational outlier in my immediate family, I was the only one of my siblings and out of all of my mother's nephews and nieces to be born in the United States. My childhood was spent mostly in Miami, Florida. You guys know Miami, Florida? Hey, okay. Any FIU announcement? Okay, that's where I'm from. All right. Well, that's where I was born. Everyone else was born in Dominican Republic. Florida was, even though I was born in Miami, my childhood was very transnational and transgenerational. It was a very transnational and transgenerational experience. So I had frequent visits to the Dominican Republic, and those visits, along with daily doses of my mother's stories about life on the half island, because it's a half island. The other side of Dominican Republic, y'all, is Haiti, okay? Of the Hispaniola. So those stories really shaped who I am. All right, I got misplaced, and I don't know if it's because beautiful Crystal came to take a picture, but here I am. And they also anchored my understanding of my historical and geographical situatedness. While I would hate to exceptionalize my mother, at the same time, I know that she was very comfortable with being different. In fact, she embraced being different. For example, there was a phrase my aunts often used to silence the kids in my family. Translated from Spanish to English, this phrase goes, children talk when chickens pee. All right. For those of you who may have grown up around chickens, you know that chickens never urinate like us mammals do. They have like a little paste where everything is all together. So basically, my aunts were telling us that children talk when they said children talk when chickens pee, they were letting us know that children's voices were not welcome. But for many reasons, will come, I don't know when, but they'll come. My mother rarely silenced me. Instead, she encouraged my questions and curiosity. I came to learn in the 1900s, so the first decade of the 20th century. And he actually left my grandmother, her mom, as a widow. So he passed away when my mom was 11 years old. He also entertained her insatiable questions. While the American public schools I attended failed to discuss the imperial influences the United States has had on Caribbean nations and beyond, Mommy's stories helped me locate and fill in those omissions. Okay, I said that already. So her father, for example, was an unwilling soldier who, from the age of 11 to 18, participated in a successful resistance against the U.S. occupation of the eastern region of the country. Mommy would ask my father when she was a little girl before he passed away, tough questions like, Papi, did you kill anyone? And he would answer, no, daughter, no, mija. I was in charge of taking, and I never killed anyone. So I have also, we can go to the next slide. I have also published the stories Mommy told me about my grandmother, and she was very different. She was more of the, she was a fierce woman. She was a widow who perhaps never learned how to read words or write letters, but she most certainly was apt in reading the world. In the journal Feminist Formations, you will find narratives about Mama Osa. So that was what my grandmother came to be called, Mama Osa, and how she engaged in marriages and refusals. For example, she fled to the mountains to assert her own dignity and independence as a Black woman, even as the anti-Black and anti-Haitian rhetoric of the US-backed dictator Rafael Trujillo was reaching a fever pitch throughout the island. So my mother didn't just accept being different. She was okay. She was fine with being different. She was also never ashamed to tell me about the marginalizing experiences that she in a way that always centered their ingenuity and emphasized their ability to maximize every single resource that they found. In other words, she didn't bear the burden of internalized stigma. She didn't like silence her experiences. And she didn't feel like it was her responsibility to carry that stigma because it was other people who were shutting her out of opportunities. So the most influential stories in shaping my career path and areas of inquiry were the stories Mommy told me about her childhood longing to attend schools. See, Mommy never went to school. She never did elementary. We like to use the phrase first generation college students in the United States. Mommy, and I guess me and my kids, me and my brothers and sisters, we were first generation elementary primary schools as students. So after her father passed away, and to help lessen the load on my grandmother, Mommy and her mom agreed for her to become an unpaid servant of a wealthy family who promised my grandmother that they would pay for her school, but they never did. So she was her steward. She was with her stewards for many years. And although they never followed through with that promise, my mother became an auto act. And for her family, the family that she worked for. During her limited free time, she used to love to write poems and read local newspapers and on and on. And my mother made the most of her proximity to wealthier Dominicans because although her families only lived a few miles away and they lived high in the mountains, they lived lower in the town. Mommy was exposed to a world of much greater comforts than her parents could ever provide her, even if she toiled every day to keep those comforts up for her mistress's family. Okay, beyond the metaphor, Mommy's experience were an embodiment of what Audre Lorde warned us, that the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. Proximity to oppressors may seem to grant access to greater comfort, but it never removes oppressive dynamics. Throughout her youth, Mommy repeatedly attempted to sever ties with her stewards. Each time she ran away, they would seek her out and bring her back, trying to convince that things would get better. Through those years, Mommy carefully managed the little bit of money my grandmother periodically gave her, and sometimes she would earn tips from the people who would visit the house. By the age of 18, she successfully parted ways with the family to make her own path, one which paved the way for me to explain to you how I came to a field like special education. So through my understandings of Mommy's stories, I constructed a decolonial Black feminist orientation that actively pushes against the marginalization of vulnerable people. Okay, I'll just wrap this up with the final words. In truth, that is how I became to special education, a field that on one side touts to inclusive education for students with disabilities, but in the United States, it has also been used as a tool to keep Black children ensnared in what we call a school to prison nexus, and other people call school prison pipeline. So these ethics are not just theoretical orientations, they are inherited, they are lived, and they are reanimated through storytelling. Even now, as I'm talking to you, I hear Mommy's whispers as I speak. Gentle, insistent reminders that our stories matter, that survival is knowledge, and that dignity must defy silences. In centering Mommy's stories, examining their historicity, and engaging in mappings of my and other family members' exits and reroutings across educational institutions, I unapologetically cite her as the source, the influence of my thinking research, despite the normative expectations in an overwhelmingly white field like special education. Thank you. Thank you, Grandma. Thank you.
Thank you. The next slide, please. So next up, we have Dr. Saeed, who will be joining us online. So if you can pull up his Zoom, that would be very great. And Saeed, right there.
Yes, I am.
Okay, you can look up a little bit, but I'll be updating you on your time left in our chat. So
Okay.
are you able to bring the slides and the image together? Like, we want to see his slides and we also want to see him.
He basically has to share his slides because they don't know how to do it.
If you all right, Saeed,
Yeah.
let us know when you want us to shift your slides.
Okay, that works. So can I kick off then? Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me. Sorry, I can't be in the room presently. I'm feeling major FOMO. I'd hoped to be there, but I had to travel for other research. My name is Saeed Husseini. I am a research fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja. And I'm presenting on a project oriented around digitizing the archives of the Nigerian left. And it's a project that started in 2022, at the end of 2022. So it was run for about 2.5 years. And it's funded by the French Institute for Research in Africa, with the funding housed at the Center for Democracy and Development and a range of partner organizations, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment. So I guess this differs in some ways from the presentations we've just heard from the point of view, or from based on the fact that this is uh, a project to create an archive in some respects and to generate different kind of archival practice. Um, it's hoped that I, amongst other people, can also make use of this archive in the future for research. And so at that point, maybe I'll be able to say a bit about how this archive has informed research. But at the moment, it's more of a action project in some respects than it is a research one. But there is nonetheless underlying analytical motivation, one could say, for the focus on the Nigerian left. And if I could summarize it, I would say that you could argue that the history of radicalism in Africa, especially radicalism of a revolutionary anti-capitalist variety, has tended to be dominated by accounts of movements or individuals that took power. So, for instance, we know, of course, a lot about Nkrumah, Nyerere, Cabral, Nasser. These figures loom large, and the political parties they were part of, or social movements. So we have a better understanding, for instance, of the ANC in exile and other liberation parties in Southern Africa, the Ethiopian revolutionaries, who also spent some time in Canada. So interesting to see that intersection. But we know much less about African radicalism in context where the left was in opposition. And I think this has tended to create what you might call a double silence. Because on the one hand, it reifies the kind of colonial boundary, that separates the sort of radical states from the conservative states. But in practice, African radicals defied these national borders. And then secondly, so just for an example, you can think of like Nigerians that served in the Nkrumah government, or folks who were exchanging letters, writing speeches and such across countries. And then, a second erasure occurs in the countries themselves, where, given that the radical opposition has tended to remain on the margins politically, their histories are also often written out of accounts of, or narratives of independence and post-colonial development. And Nigeria is a prime example of that. So this is, I guess, one of the underlying sort of analytical motivations that has propelled this project. And I'll talk a little bit now about some of the methods that we've pursued in the course of this project. And so we can move to the second slide. So this is the slide on existing archiving tradition, if that's come up. So okay, so I can't see the PowerPoint, but I hope that we're on the second slide now.
We're getting there, but you can go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. So I said earlier that we are trying to create a new archive. In fact, that's not precisely accurate. It's more so, it's probably better to say that we're trying to bring light to existing archives by digitizing them and making them available online. And this is because there has interestingly been a long-standing kind of bottom-up tradition of archiving amongst a certain group of radicals that collectively came to be known as the Nigerian left. So these folks, for some reason, reasons that I can explain a little bit about, gathered and kept meticulous documentation of their activities, of their activism, of their exchanges across continents and across the country, forming what you might call a kind of activist archiving practice. So in this slide, if it's come up now, you'll see a range of families and in some cases institutions that kept materials from, in some cases now, family members that are belated, that were central actors in the history of the Nigerian left, of a revolutionary, anti-capitalist, feminist, Pan-Africanist struggle in Nigeria. So there is an archiving tradition that this project is kind of plugging into, and it's more so that we are trying to digitize these archives and kind of preserve them for a future generation, especially in cases where they're falling into some disrepair. Um, so I guess if I could say something briefly about why these folks kept so much material. I mean, two reasons I'd highlight is one, they didn't want to be erased. They sensed the situation that they were in, one in which they were, um, for a long time, oppositional forces, and one in which the kind of mainstream narrative was already writing them out. And I think, secondly, that they were also keeping information in the expectation that their history could one day become the official history if they were to take power. So it was a kind of hopeful project as well. So on the slide, you'll see a list of names, some in black. The ones in black are the archives that we've actually already started digitizing, in some cases completed. And the process, in practical terms, involves hiring often activists affiliated to the family or institution, training them in sorting, indexing, sort of day-to-day work of archiving, and then also training them in digitizing and uploading the materials. And we have a website which is already free to access. You can find it on archivesofnigerianleft.ng or alternatively at nigerianradicalism.net. And then the names in red are the ones where we've had an initial conversation and the family or institution, they're happy to move forward with the project, but it hasn't commenced yet. And in green are organizations, families, institutions that we've talked to, but we haven't really yet hammered out a plan. The third slide just gives you a visual of what some of the collections look like when we encounter them. So if you can see the slide now, so it may look like these materials are in a mess, and sometimes it feels that way when you walk into the door. But upon actually seeing what's inside of them, you realize that they actually are a testament to how families and institutions have tried to preserve something of the past, even if in the face of intense repression, and the impoverishment that has resulted from being on the margins economically and politically for decades. The slide that follows this one, the fourth slide, just shows some images from the overall process. As I mentioned, we kind of conduct an assessment of the sorts of materials I showed above, and then we go about sorting, indexing, scanning, and uploading. And different teams come up with slightly different methods for how to actually digitize or index or label the materials. And at the end, what we're finding on the website, what we've produced is not a uniform kind of archiving method, but one that's bottom up and actually driven by the categorizations and aspirations of activists that are closest to the original archive holders and archive owners. So another quick thing to say is that not all the material that's digitized is then uploaded. The families do make a decision about what they want to be public and what they want to preserve for themselves. But all the material is digitized, and the original digital copy remains in perpetuity with the original archive holders. So as mentioned, we have a website. In the next slide, slide 5, you'll see that in addition to the website, we've also tried to take the archive beyond the internet and kind of outside of the buildings where they've been housed and into the public arena. So you can see some pictures from some recent events that were held by some of the institutions that are part of this. The Socialist Library and Archive Center in Calabar, one of the first institutions that was part of this, held a kind of activation event, and to borrow a term I heard from Crystal at one point, to engage with communities that are close to the archives, activists, NGO workers that are sort of were affiliated to the community that created the archive, and sort of take them through what it would look like to access it. So kind of taking the archive out of the ivory tower in some ways into potential users. And then we also held last week in Abuja as part of a wider festival, an exhibition of some of the materials in the archive that pertain to the pro-democracy struggle in Nigeria through the 90s. And interesting, we had a proposal from a curator who came across the website and wanted to exhibit some of the materials. So it was another quite inspiring moment of sort of, you could say, bottom up experience of the archive, kind of speaking to people and then speaking outward to a new audience. So finally, I want to make note of just a few contradictions and challenges that have emerged in the sixth slide. In the course of the project, I mean, as with a lot of these new archiving projects, the question of funding and sustainability always arise. And I think art, sorry, as the slide come up.
Yes, it's there.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I think ours, this question is somehow a little intensified by the fact that we're digitizing archives of the left, Pan-Africanist struggle and the anti-colonial struggle, but receiving funding from, in fact, the French Research Institute. And this poses practical challenges in some cases because some of the folks that we want to digitize, due to very understandable anti-imperialist ideas, are hesitant to be part of this project. You know, our funding source also generates potential problems and silences in this kind of archive that we're trying to create. There's also an ongoing risk of co-optation. I mean, the current government in Nigeria certainly defines itself as a pro-democracy activist, which might seem laughable to some people, but it's how they self-conceptualize. One of the results of this has been that some of the individuals in the archive are being kind of already actively sort of highlighted by the government as people they want to support. There was an example of this like barely last week, in the June 12 celebration. One of the key individuals in the archive, Edwin Madunagu, was awarded a national honors for his contributions to the pro-democracy struggle. Of course, the half-heartedness of the regime came through when they awarded a posthumous honor to somebody who's still alive. Yeah, and then finally, I think a concern I want to make note of in this context within the ivory towers, what you might call a kind of geneocracy, or what you might identify as the divide between mental and manual labor. So a lot of the people in the archive are academics. There's some that were sort of organic intellectuals, to borrow a term. They were intellectuals within the working class, but broadly speaking, it was people in the academy. And I think that sort of academic, I want to say status distinction has kind of cut across the history of left radicalism in Africa and is very pronounced in Nigeria. And there's an extent to which conducting an activist archiving project, putting materials online, perpetuates that division, right? Because materials online are going to be accessed by people with strong internet and who can pay for internet, which is increasingly not the case for a lot of workers in Nigeria. So this is something we want to think about how to kind of surpass or surmount, sublimate. I'm not sure what the term is, but address in the future. So I'll leave it there, really. There's one more slide that just is a fun collage of some pictures and images and materials from the archive. The slide 7 and top right is a picture. You can't see it so clearly, but it's a poster that says "Free Gani Fayemi," from the era when there was the Abacha must go struggle. People often think Abacha wasn't resisted, but he really was. And then the big picture on the left is someone that might be known to folks in the room, NLB, when she was sworn in as the student union government, the first female student union government president at the University of Jos. So yeah, that's some of the fun stuff we've encountered. There's a lot else in there, but I'll just leave those maybe for future discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saeed. Next, we'll go to Nanre. We have your slides queued up. Or we're queuing them up. You can go to the next slide. Yes, we're ready for you. And I think Nanre is going to try to unmute her video so we can be seeing her.
Okay, can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let me know if I need to turn it off if the connection's not good. Hi everyone. I'm very excited to be here engaging in this online space, although I wish I was with you in Lagos. My name is Nanre Nafsiger. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And my presentation today is talking about excavation. So, reclaiming histories of conflict through youth participatory action research. So, it's related to the archives and archival practices, but more on history making and what I call collaborative history making, and how we engage in histories that may not be written down, especially histories of conflict through using different methodologies working with young people. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to just briefly go through a few different points. I have a lot of visual slides, but I'm going to start with my positionality. I'm going to talk about the context of Plateau State. I'm going to talk about my methodologies and my theories, and then just a little bit about the process of the research and how that takes place, and then really think about impacts and continuities, ethics and discontinuities, as well as what we can learn as Africana researchers doing historical work on the continent and in our hometowns. Next slide, please. So this is me. I'm the younger daughter here. I don't know if you can see the slides, yes?
Yeah. Yes. Very cute.
Okay.
Very cute.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is me and my sister and my mother and my little brother is actually in my mom's tummy. This is a picture taken in Jos very long ago. I won't say when. But I consider myself to be a Jos girl for life. I was raised in Jos. I grew up there and I returned there as an adult and as a researcher to re-engage with my community. And qualitative research really asks of us to really embrace our positionality and also to continue to interrogate it over time, even as we change our practices and even as we discover new ways of re-engaging. And so I, as a researcher, have had, even though I grew up in Nigeria and returned there as a young adult and spent a significant amount of my life there, about 70%, I'm still someone that has the positionality of being educated abroad, right? So a lot of my education has been in the United States, in England. And so this is also impacts my positionality as a researcher. But I also, in this presentation, want to identify that I feel I often occupy kind of an interstitial space. I'm not exactly someone that can be defined as kind of the Japa person because I have spent a significant amount of my life in both countries. And so I don't consider myself someone that's having permanently left or actually looking for opportunity to leave permanently. I'm also not necessarily part of what I consider to be a diaspora because I feel like I'm always wanting to return home. And also having worked with communities in the United States, especially my comrades and colleagues who are African American or African Canadian, I really also feel that there's a differentiation in which I occupy some similarities, but not all in terms of our positionality. Also, as a researcher, I decided consciously to return home to do my research. Actually, the chair of this session encouraged me to return to JOS for my doctoral research. And it was really a life-changing moment to return on my own terms to engage in research. And so I also want to acknowledge that I also during the time that I had left and been away from my state, there were dramatic changes, right? And my town had turned from a city which was really known as the home of peace and tourism to a place that was really known for war. And so part of my research and my positionality has also been acknowledging the conflict that is taking place in Plateau State and in Jos, but also decentering that conflict to also embrace the communities that are living and thriving despite the conflict. Finally, before I go into the next part, I do want to say that I want to acknowledge the ongoing massacres in the Middle Belt. And of course, we know Benue had a major massacre over the last week, and many have taken place in and around Jos as well. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. I'm going too slow for my slides. So next slide is just a few pictures of Plateau State. For those of you who are not familiar, it used to be known as a home of tourism, but right now, if you hear the words Jos, you're probably going to think about conflict. Next slide, City of Jos. So that's what Jos looked like when I left. It has changed a lot, but a lot of it has also stayed the same. Next slide, please. This is for those of you who are not familiar with the map. This, of course, is Plateau State, and most of my work is conducted in two local governments: Jos North Local Government and Jos South Local Government. Next slide. So just thinking a bit about methodologies and theories, I use a intersection of theories, building on both African American and North American based theories such as critical race theory, but also theories from the global South like decolonial theory, Black and African feminist thought, and Black historical consciousness. The methodologies that I use for discovering history work are based in the tradition of youth participatory action research, but also Black emancipatory research and what I call collaborative history making. Next slide, please. So how I engage with this work is really working. YPAR involves youth directly in the research process. And as you can see in these pictures, these are young people in Jos during my research. And youth in my research are considered history makers in terms of them being people that make history, but also in terms of those who are actively documenting history. And so I push against these negative conceptualizations that people often have of young people and work to equip youth researchers to center histories of conflict across generations. And also I have come to see that my research with young people has served as a way to repair and reconcile both different generations, but also in between different groups within Jos and within Plateau State. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the youth research teams. What we do is we work over a series of participatory sessions to decide how to research what is happening in the communities. I work with 4 communities in Jos, and I've been working with them for over a decade. And the youth go out into communities and collect oral histories through audio recording mostly, and also through video recording if the participant would like. Most of it is through audio recording, these oral histories, and a lot of it is actually done in Hausa. So these are 2 research teams. This is part of the process as well. A very huge part is actually conceptualizing with young people and helping them
Breaking up a
learn to
bit.
question.
No, you're breaking
Sorry?
up a bit. You're breaking up just a bit.
Okay, I'll take off my camera. Hopefully it will help. Okay. I hope that helps.
Yes, yeah.
So as you can see in this picture, the slide should be conceptualizing with young people and learning to question. So as we all know, education in Nigeria has really continued a kind of colonial tradition in which young people are asked to kind of take in information, regurgitate it out. So part of the process of even engaging young people as researchers is helping them to learn to question. And so they are part of the process of creating questions, of thinking through what histories they want to learn about, and actually being through this process that you can ask questions, you can interrogate, you can ask your elders and people in the community, and you have that kind of right to know and to understand. So as you see here, they're thinking about questions on a whiteboard. Most of the time we use schools and communities to begin this research. Next slide, please. So here you see again, this is just part of the research process. Young people, we divide up into groups and do a lot of the work together, sometimes outside, sometimes inside, just really navigating the different temperatures and climates that are going on as well. Okay, so I time myself. The next slide, please. So in this slide, excavations, you can see some of the work how this work actually plays out in the community. So you can see the picture of the rocks, the kinds of way that the young people you see in black kind of close and far are walking out into communities to gather these histories. And this is the process. And then you can see 2 pictures here, one of a female and one of a male leader in the community. Some are elders, some are just community leaders. And this is the process in which the young people kind of gather around and learn from them and also record and take these histories. Next slide, please. So here you can see another group of researchers. I don't know if you can read their shirts have a Fanon quote on the back. And this is kind of what they wear as to go out into the communities. Next slide, please. So after we go out and after we create the questions, we go through the interviews, we record them. The next is the process of the post-field work sessions where we're sorting, we're sitting in the data, we're talking through the data, and we're trying very much to stay true to the information that we've gathered. We work together to do co-analysis of what exactly we feel are the important themes. And then the final part is that we figure out how we want to present this back to our communities. Next slide. So the final part of the research process, which is kind of ongoing, we kind of have an intensive session and then we come back to it, is we have a mini conference and a community presentation. So you can see here, this is at the National Museum in Jos. The young people gather for the first day to kind of do their own work and also learn more about the subjects they might not be aware of. And then the next day is the community presentation. Next slide, please. So some of the ways in which participatory research asks us to also not just look at what is known, but also to have the obligation of what is unknown. So many of these youth had asked questions that were not answered in their research. They didn't know about Nigerian history. They didn't know about African history. And so part of what they required and asked was we got community speakers. This is a student from University of Jos to come and speak. And if you can see his presentation, it says African resistance movements from slavery to present age. So also bringing in learning to the process so that young people can be empowered through the research process. Next slide, please. We have a lot of fun, build a lot of relationships, and this is part of what you can see. And also you can see in one of the pictures, the young people are learning to operate cameras. And actually this young man continued to do this after the research and actually is now a professional doing video camera work. So next slide, please. This is just the youth culture and history. This is the community invitation to ask people from the community to come out and learn about the work that we've done. It's done in the National Museum, which is a very central location in the city, which is also important. And then next slide, please. Just a few pictures of what that looks like, sitting in circles. If you can see the youth on the floor are making a presentation of their research through drama, through poetry, through song. They present back their findings. Next slide, please. So here you can see another cross section. Community members are then given the opportunity to respond, to ask questions. And so here you see some people coming. We had such a huge crowd. We had to divide all the food that we got into half packs because so many people came out. We weren't expecting it. And as you can see, the chairs were full. People brought their babies. This is my daughter in the corner here, also part of the research team. And it's just a really great moment where people just expressed so much interest in this project. And there was no need to pay them, no transportation. They just really, they came on their own. Next slide, please. So just in closing about this, the reflection here, you can see this is a young person's final reflection on the project, which we do after everything. And they talk about really gaining from this research process, but also and learning about their community. But at the end, you can also see some of the gaps is that even though they learned about their community, because we know history has not been in the curriculum, they also said at the very bottom of the page, I don't know much about Nigeria, and that has been what has stayed the same for me. So still thinking about continue, and I'll get back to that in one of the final slides. Next slide, please. So yeah, so reflecting on the impact of this work, continuities and discontinuities, really important in the process of creating this historical learning process is intergenerational learning, but also a very important part was friendship across religious and ethnic lines. So my project was conducted in two Muslim communities.
You're breaking up a bit, and you're also behind.
I'm over time. Okay. So I'll just quickly wrap up. And so you can just see some of the results here is that the youth have continued to work and build relationships, but also many we have lost ties with and they have become disengaged. So just my final slide, key learnings for Africana research, reclaiming and remapping archives. This work sought to recenter communities as knowledge holders and knowledge makers. thinking about how we return to our villages in Nigeria, especially in the southeast. People tend to build houses in their villages. So my thought is, what do we as researchers build and how do we give back to our community? So thinking about returning to our villages and our homes to build work. Research should matter. It should impact the communities. And we have a research ethic that is different from others and ongoing responsibilities to our community. We also are responsible to discontinue Western imperialist and colonial methodologies and to see research in this context as a way to restore and reconcile communities. And I will end there. This is my email, and you can scan the QR code if you would like to follow my work. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you so much, Nanre. We'll go to the next slide. I'll be our last presenter and look forward to a very vibrant conversation across the presentations. So you can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier when I introduced myself, I am a scholar, but I'm also an organizer. And it's actually through the joining of scholarly work and organizing that I come to community archiving work. And so I'm an African American, but most of my research has been in Nigeria. In the United States. Part of the work that you'll hear about today is exactly what Nanre just mentioned. How do we engage with our actual communities in sort of stewarding and also redistributing the gains and the tools of our scholarly research? And so today you'll be hearing about the Move Activist Archive, which preserves the organizational history and the collective memory of the MOVE organization. The MOVE organization, which I'll take time in my presentation today to introduce a bit more, was a revolutionary Black organization that was founded in Philadelphia in 1972. It was subjected to horrific state violence that you'll hear about. And one of the beautiful things about MOVE is, despite being subjected to political incarceration for decades and state murder, they have developed an archive to tell their own story. And so part of the work that I do as the archive director of the MOVE organization, and you can go to the next slide, is to work with MOVE members, many of whom are still living, to tell MOVE's story through its own archive from its own perspective. And so similar to what Saeed discussed in terms of the concept of an activist archive, the MOVE Activist Archive, yes, is an archive of activism. It's an archive that's about state violence, but it's also an activist archive in the sense that we are thinking about Black archival practice, Black memory work as a form of activism. So much of the history of Black radicalism, whether it's in Philadelphia or here in Nigeria, it's told from the perspective of the state, right? But part of what we are challenging is political histories of resistance. We understand ourselves as a counter archive, a liberatory project, an anti-colonial project, an anti-capitalist project, and one that is challenging the state. I currently serve as the archive director. It's one of the great honors of my life to be able to work alongside these heroes who have been fighting for Black liberation, global Black liberation, for over 50 years, and they are still alive and still fighting. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to spend my time talking just a bit about the history. I imagine that many of you have not heard of the MOVE organization before, and so I would love to take this opportunity to share a bit of MOVE's history with you. And then I want to talk about MOVE's archival practice and what I think we can learn from MOVE's approach to telling its own story. So what you see here is an image from around 1977 of members of the MOVE organization who, every member of MOVE, in joining the organization, they took the surname Africa. So Mike Africa Jr. Is a blood relative of the founder of MOVE, John Africa, who you'll hear about in a moment. But the organization was filled with teenagers, people in their 20s for the most part, who were revolutionaries and fighting for a world that was free from white supremacy, domination. They were environmentalists. They believed in communal living. You see that they have dreadlocks, right? They were very much invested in a natural lifestyle. And that was where the organization started. You can go to the next slide. Some of what you'll see in my presentation is are images of some of the archival materials that MOVE preserved and collected over the years. And so John Africa, who founded MOVE, had a third grade education, but he was an incredible intellectual and a philosopher and an architect of Black liberatory struggle. And his family members, he dictated his teachings to them, and they became essentially MOVE's sacred text, its Bible, which they called the guidelines. And so one of the ways he describes MOVE is he says, we called ourselves the movement, which they shortened to MOVE. And it says MOVE is not an acronym. It means activity. It means running dogs, running ourselves, washing cars, demonstrating, and essentially movement towards the kind of libertary future that can hold our collective aspirations. You can go to the next slide. But part of what happens is that in trying to pursue its revolutionary beliefs, it encountered the carceral state. And it encountered specifically the Philadelphia police. And this is a record from 1974, a press release where MOVE says that since 1974, they're writing this in 1975, members of MOVE had been arrested over 110 times. They were held for bail of over $225,000. And this is the 1970s. So you can imagine how much $250,000 in bail represents. Their members were beaten, pregnant women were kicked in the stomach, small children were slapped and trampled by police. And so the state's violence towards MOVE radicalized MOVE's purpose and practice. So what I'll describe next very briefly is MOVE's confrontations with the state. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the first of two very important dates in MOVE history. The first is August 8th, 1978. MOVE members lived communally, meaning they lived together, they grew their own food, they birthed their own babies at home before it was a popular thing to do. However, they were a threat to the system because they were exposing the lies of the carceral state. They were exposing the injustices of the carceral state. So on August 8th, 1978, hundreds of police officers came to evict them from their home. They used tear gas, they used to remove them from their home. In the process, one police officer was murdered by friendly fire by another police officer, but they arrested 9 MOVE members and sentenced them to between 40 and 100 years in prison. And so they didn't framed by the state, as many Black revolutionaries were during this time period. So on the next slide, you'll see the second sort of confrontation after the state makes MOVE political prisoners. So on May 13th, 1985, the members of the state the members of the organization that were not political prisoners, who had been fighting for 7 years for the release of the MOVE 9, as they were called, and the children of the political prisoners who were penal orphans, which is what we call people who have parents, but they're political prisoners or incarcerated. The city of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on their home and murdered 11 people, including 5 children. And they also burned down 2 city blocks, which you see there. And over 61 families had their homes burned down. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the names of the MOVE members who were killed by the state and their ages. For the sake of time, I want to move forward. And then on the next slide, you see one of the more recent efforts and successes of MOVE in telling its own story. In 2020, after the surviving members of the MOVE 9 were finally released from prison after 40 years, Mike Africa Jr., who I co-run the MOVE Activist Archive with, he's a second-generation MOVE member. He was actually born in prison. His two parents were members of the MOVE 9. He released a documentary telling the story of his fight to free his family. If you go to the next slide, you'll see examples of MOVE trying to, oh, I switched the order. You'll see examples of MOVE trying to tell its own story. But one thing I want to begin to leave you with is this idea of MOVE's revolutionary activist archive practice, which means, or how we describe it is that we tell our own stories. And if we don't tell our own stories, we steward the process of telling our stories. And if we don't steward the process, then we protest it. And what that means is that gone are the days of people telling our stories for us. Gone are the days in which we accept a colonial state gaze of our lives. And so the MOVE Activist Archive is about people telling their own stories. So some examples of that very briefly, you can move ahead, is self-published MOVE works, which are pamphlet self-published books that tell MOVE story. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the actual archival materials themselves, which MOVE members over the course of 40 years collected in their basements, kept in their attics. And initially, they kept it as a strategy to help free their family members that were imprisoned and to seek justice for their family members that were murdered by the state. So collecting and preserving the history was an actual activist strategy for reparative justice. And our archive is unprecedented in the sense that we have tens of thousands of materials that include published and unpublished writings, that include prison letters, propaganda, protest flyers, signs, legal documents, things that were actually rescued from the house that was bombed in 1985, thousands of tapes, CDs, DVDs. It's actually quite an incredible collection. If you go to the next slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about, you can go to the next slide, some of our archival practices, which include protests. We approach protest as a form of archival practice where we use the space of protest itself to re-narrate our history and to tell our own stories. If you go to the next slide, you'll see an example of a protest on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. We found out 4 years ago that after the bombing in 1985, the anthropology department at the University of Pennsylvania stole the remains of children who were bombed in 1985 without the knowledge and consent of their family members. So like I said, we tell our own stories, we steward the process, or we protest it. And that's exactly what we did here. If you go to the next slide, you can actually see me somewhere in there. Every year since 1978, MOVE has held a day of remembrance where we re-narrate the history at the site in which it happened. This is at Osage Avenue, where the houses have been rebuilt, but you see there are hundreds of communities coming together to mark this important date, May 13th. If you go to the next slide. We also, Mike and I created something called the Black Resistance Tour of Philadelphia, where we have curated a physical and a virtual tour. If you go to the QR code, you can actually access it virtually, but we tell the story of radical sites of resistance, of Black resistance throughout the city of Philadelphia, and we actually take people to those sites of resistance. And then go to the next slide. But we are also, like Saeed discussed, building an archive, right? We are doing the difficult work of organizing tens of thousands of archival materials. And for us, this is not an opaque process. We invite young people, students, elders, community members to participate in the process of archival practice, to also learn how to preserve the histories that are important to them. Go to the next slide. This is a teach-in where we occupied space at the university campus where they stole the remains. And we did a live oral history interview where we talked about the children and the lives of the people who were bombed and burned by the city. Go to the next slide. And then as of last year, we're actually on our second year of creating actual physical exhibits that people can visit and interact with our archival materials. Our first exhibit was last year called Move the Old Days. And you can see just some images of us figuring out how to exhibit these archival materials. And you can go to the next slide and see another example of some of these materials, including the burned materials from the house from 1985. And then you can go to the next slide. I think I'm at the end. But you can also learn more about the work that we're doing. The Move Activist Archive site, which is under construction, is available at movearchive.com or .org. In 2023, Mike Africa Jr. was able to buy back the house that was bombed. After murdering his family members in 1985, they stole the house through eminent domain. They took the house from the family, and it took 38 years for us to buy it back, but we had to buy it through a mortgage and pay over $400,000 to buy back the house that the city bombed. That's a whole other story. And so I'll stop there and open the conversation up for questions. But one thing I'll just mention is that even though we have done separate presentations here, all of us are colleagues, all of us are friends and comrades, and there's many connections across our works. For example, Nanre, I wasn't sure if you were going to present about the JOS project or the Africana Collaborative History Project. Nanre and I have also collaborated on working with NSAR's activists and organizers to archive this very recent movement history that is already being sort of shifted and retold and sort of taken away from its grassroots. And as well, we have a few different collaborations with Saeed that hopefully one day we will get to actually see through. So I'll stop there and thank you all for your attention. And we welcome any questions or comments you have. Please join us. And if you don't mind coming forward so that our comrades online can hear us very well. Or actually, I could have come back. Don't worry, I'll come to you.
Oh, thank you, Jerome. Hold it.
You can hold it, yeah.
Okay.
We can't hear anymore.
But a lot on a research basis that may not be actually now in practice that are being used to kind of disparity that. Yes, black children, yeah. And
You can ask, you can just collect.
okay. And then the next question to Crystal, I guess amazing work that you're doing. And pardon me, I grew up in the suburbs in Long Island. So what you're speaking about, I feel really hits hard home. In the wake of like the anti-critical race theory culture that we were dealing with in the United States, public education, especially like in the suburbs, and telling the story of groups like Panthers, like the movement, how can that be countered in areas that it can be difficult to reach? Specifically, I would look at my area, Long Island, New York, where the narrative is very negative when it comes to those particular groups, that they're usually associated with like the Weather Underground, that they were terrorist organizations or radical, a very minor role in terms of Black, nationalism and actually helping us in terms of our place. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Dao. I'm a lecturer at Koladaisi University, Ibadan, Nigeria. Listening to you speak, I was getting inspirations for research, as a matter of fact. I'm very open to ideas and I love it. I picked up something, your research, I think it's about violence against Blacks, that the movement is about. And I saw parallel patterns against like what happened in apartheid South Africa concerning like when Blacks protest against injustices, they are oppressed, be it by whites and dictatorial systems in the government, in the society. So I saw the pattern of apartheid in what you just discussed, and I saw the pattern of Ken Saro-Wiwa's story in 1995 and how he was killed and arrested, and they were all hanged, the Ogoni Five. And I'm thinking of drawing patterns, comparing what's happening in Move Your Country and apartheid South Africa, and in Nigeria, as a matter of fact, because oppression against Blacks is a recurring phenomenon, and it's not just unique to one country alone. So you've opened my eyes to all of that, because I felt maybe in America, you said in the 1970s, I was expecting racism or oppression against Blacks to have reduced considerably, but you made it known that it was exponential, it increased tremendously, and it was impressive to know that. So I'm thinking of this comparison, but I need materials from Move. If you would be willing to share with me, because I'm a literary critic. I can work with publications about all the things you just talked about. Publications in apartheid South Africa and the one in Ogoni in Rivers State. To just make this comparison and study the patterns, the oppression against, the violence against Blacks, to learn things about how this works and how these patterns can be learned from to actually prevent it from future reoccurrence. So I would really commend you for what you've done and the devotion. And you were not born in that period, I suppose. And you've been able to actually revive the spirit of Move. So congratulations to you. Thank you.
Well, I have a question. Okay, so I really appreciate listening to all your talks and watching the historians do their historian things. But I think as a literary scholar, part of what's really animates my work and my interests is the idea of storytelling as a political act, not just an art, but an art and a political act. And I think about the idea of having narrative agency and narrative authority, even, especially like when you talk about these counter movements, the ways that they don't get, the stories. I think Said's talk, the story of the movement is told from the angle of the state, and the state claims the narrative authority where that's concerned, whereas the agency to tell the story from within the movement is something that you're doing, right, with the archive. And so that's commendable, to take the word from over there. But I'm also thinking about, when you were talking, you mentioned that anthropology department's very perverse archive, right, of the bodies of the bombed children. That was really affecting for me to hear. And so while, preserve, like the materials, the thousands, tens of thousands of materials that you have preserved, or even like with Funke's, Dr. Alade Jabi's presentation, where she talks about the yearbooks, like being able to look at these material things that have been cataloged for a variety of reasons, but have been preserved long enough for us to now reread them and apply these new sort of like critical lenses to them, and sort of excavate the stories in a different way. They're all very useful, and that's great, obviously. But I'm also thinking about the other kinds of counter archives that are immaterial, like with your presentation or I think Nanre's presentation. So how do we pull these more immaterial forms of claiming or reclaiming narrative agency or authority into archives? And when I think archive, I think something that is kept towards the idea of preserving or passing on not just the knowledge itself in a meaningful way, but I think one of you used the word stewardship. Not just the actual like details of the events or the facts of the actual like kernels or bytes of knowledge, but that sort of sense of responsibility towards stewardship in a way that can go on, like can, what is an archive if it's immaterial, right? I think that's really where the question, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. What is a concept archive if it's immaterial? And I think like it might be, part of me thinks, it might be helpful to have all these pictures and recordings and things that are not just written, texts, because in a lot of ways, like inscribing things in that way is a very Western way of building archives. Not to say it's not useful, it is, but there's so many other forms of knowledge creation. There's so many other ways of passing on a sense of whatever else, history or telling stories or claiming narrative agency that are only very poorly captured in these ways. And so I'm curious about, yeah, what is an archive if it's immaterial? Yeah.
Okay, so it's actually beautiful for me to listen to all of you. I'm so happy that I spend my time here this evening. I want to ask a specific question because I know we don't have time again. So for the Department of Anthropology that stole the body of those children, when you are trying to get it back of them, what was their objection? Do they ask that they actually stole the body? That is one. Then two, how do you manage saboteurs that are also Black people in your movement?
So how we do it this way? Thank you all for your questions and comments. I'm thinking that we can hear from each of the panelists in the order that they presented, and you can respond to any of the questions or comments. Okay. Oh,
Yeah, I have a question for you.
James, great to see you here. I see your question. I don't know why I paused, as if you would answer to us, but thank you for a great panel. Funke, could you speak to the gaps and absences in Black African Studies degree programs in Canada, which you alluded to? Also, and perhaps Nanre too, to what extent is there the resurgence in Canadian Black internationalism a province-specific experience? Okay, great. So let's start with Mildred.
Oh, wait, she was the first one, right? You said in order of.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, my bad. First
That's
one.
okay. That's fine. Mine will be really brief to answer Comfort's question quickly about the counter archive of the immaterial. A thing that you'll notice is that I didn't talk about is a lot of this stuff, particularly for the archive that I create, also is about oral histories and orality, the spaces of orality, how Black communities, particularly African knowledges, have been embedded in this idea of orality. So this is idea of communicating with each other, how we do arts, cultural practice, movie, film, all of these things. So that's all part of this arc. I just didn't get to it for this thing. And the second part of that is, thank you. The second part of that is also to teach communities about passing on this intergenerational knowledge, right? Not necessarily teach, actually, that's the incorrect word. Engage in intergenerational conversations, right? So a lot of this is happening already. For example, my father, who was the generation that came in the 1970s into schooling institutions, I was hyper aware of the way in which he saw himself, and he would exchange these stories about life, engaging with Caribbean students, engaging with his Canadian-born students. And so there is this intergenerational knowledge of who they are, who they were and are, that I think can be engaged in as a theoretical practice, as a way we can think about that as historical practice and and scholarly work, but not exclusively that. So I think that that's already happening, if that makes sense. Like the counter archive of the material is already happening. It's already there. It's just not digested by the institution in the same way, which I don't have a problem with. And I also, my final story is that I actually believe that not all stories need to be told for public consumption and for the academic space. And so I think there are some things that are meant to be embedded and contained in community as part of that. So that's how I don't think I've reconciled it, but that's how I've processed it. We'll continue talking. Okay, Canada. Oh, so Canada hasn't developed a full Black studies program minor in the ways that you would see in the United States, or even in the ways that you would see in various African. There's not that. And part of this is even having this long-standing history in the 50s and 60s where there are these programming. None of it has developed or evolved into a national movement. And part of this is because Blackness has been segmented and racialized in particular ways. And as a result of that, it's been erased from the academic space. And I think that's it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I just had to be quick.
You're awesome. Thank you. So the question about the disproportionality, which is what you're asking. So in the United States, there's the paradox that the civil rights movements, which is Black people, right, and their thinking and their fighting and their brilliance, ushered in special education in many ways, like Black versus the Board of Education, which had so much Black activism, movement, thinking behind it, is what ushered in what eventually became special education. So it has this like activist civil rights background, yet the field is incredibly anti-Black, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the field is overwhelmingly white people. So then I have found, and I hate to do it, like this like distinction between special education practice and then special education as a research community, because in practice, there's many Black people involved in actual special education. Like you said yourself, you're a Black parent, you have a child, but yet in the field, it's mostly not only is it mostly white people. Yes, there's a lot of white women, but the voices that are the most powerful are actually white men, and white men who initially trained the researchers who were white women. So some of the things that has been really frustrating for me is, for example, for the last 50 years, there has been an undeniable truth that Black students are overrepresented in special education, not because they actually have cognitive impairments, but because usually white teachers tend to interpret their culture, their language, their ways of moving as deficit, as abnormal, as needing to be fixed. And therefore, we all kind of knew it. In fact, we were gazing at the problem for years. Disproportionality. Why are there so many Black kids in special ed? But then in the last 3 years, there's these white men who are publishing and getting a lot of attention for saying special education isn't racist, right? Special education isn't racist. And so here is something that comes from the civil rights movements, from activism, right? In practice, everybody of all race actually has disabilities. And yet special education is being used as a tool to push kids out of school and to marginalize students. So one of the things that I've actually been very active in my work is just pointing back to its origins and how it's parents of all races, how it's people and stories of folks, which stories and archival work is not even close to something that I've been trained in. I didn't even use the word archive in my presentation. So that's why I did have that question, right? I mean, it's just something I wasn't trained to do. I'm so blessed to be in community with wonderful scholars like this who tell me, actually, Mildred, you actually doing that. When you look at your mom's pictures, when you go back, that's actually this, because my field doesn't even give me the language to talk about it. And part of what I've done in kind of like, I am very well respected in my field, and I'm constantly calling them racist, right? And the reason why I've been able to do that, and what I encourage teachers, parents, and other people to do, is tell your story. Know who you're writing for, okay? 10 years ago, there was no Black people, no Black feminists in the field of special education, but I was writing for posterity, which is something I've heard in all of these other presentations, this like imagining, well, in the future, maybe somebody will go back and maybe they'll need this. And I've been documenting it. And I've been encouraging people to do what my mom taught me to do, which is, why are you embarrassed that you have a disability or that you're the only Black kid, or that's not your fault that you were denied opportunities? Why are you hiding that story? Be open about it, tell the stories, and hopefully that way we'll disrupt some of the anti-Blackness and ableism in our field.
Thank you. So, Saeed and Andre, please, if you have any final comments or reflections, Saeed, please feel free to unmute.
Yes. I don't think they can hear.
Or Nanre, I don't know if we lost Saeed.
I think he's here, but I'm okay. I don't think any question was directed to me. I think the one on Canada was answered. Thank you.
I had a question for her. Well, you can text it. We're over time. So I'll be very brief, and we can continue the conversation outside of the panel because we're over time. But to the question you raised about public education and the lack of these kind of critical histories being taught in the classroom, we've actually created a curriculum about Black history. And fortunately, we have a number of co-conspirators who happen to be educators, who classroom educators, K through 12 educators, who we have been able to work with to either officially or in a more covert way bring these histories into their classroom. And so I think there's a really valuable conversation to be had about these kind of subversive practices. I'm thinking about the teacher in Serafina that so many of us love, to kind of tell these stories even when it's not the official curriculum, right? The other thing I wanted to say about the comparison in materials, I appreciate that you saw so many threads, diasporic, Pan-African threads throughout these individual stories. And even Kensar Owiwa, I think a lot about the connections between MOVE and the Ogoni struggle. And I'd be happy to share some materials with you. And also there are novels that have been written. There are limited histories, narrative through documentaries, newspaper articles that are starting to come out, but I'd be happy to share more primary materials with you. And then the point about Penn Museum, it was an open secret amongst the anthropology and museum staff for decades. People who were a part of the forensic team to excavate the bombing site are the ones who took the remains to the museum, and they were forensic anthropologists. And once someone blew the whistle, they denied it. And then when they couldn't deny it, they said, okay, we're sorry. It was a common practice at the time. We suspected there were still more remains. And it wasn't until maybe a couple of months ago, 6 months ago, that they admitted that they had more remains. So the reality is that many of these institutions, every museum has a history like this of someone's remains that they did not give consent for. Yeah. That's the reality of the museum. That's the reality of the university. And so the situation is that we don't know how much they have actually. But we must make demands for repatriation and reparations from these institutions that have a very extractive relationship with the communities around them. And then finally, I'll say that I think part of what we're seeing in all of the presentations are concrete efforts to make the immaterial material, whether it's through, like you said, intergenerational conversations or artwork, paintings, even recognizing that the kind of everyday forms of preservation that I would say people, not just African diasporic people, but people do, whether it's Bibles with the family histories and names. You know, there are these practices that are not legitimized by the professional field of library science or history, but these are the practices that our communities have held for decades, for centuries. And so I think it's like turning to those practices, honoring those practices, creating space for those practices, and also leveraging our skills and resources to support them and have the community steward them. Like, these are the things that I'm interested in. So we're well beyond time. Thank you all so much for your attention and for your contributions. And so we look forward to more conversations. Thank you all. Thank you, Nandre. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Saeed.
Now, I have a question for you. I'm going to send it to you via email.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Just kidding, because I didn't see that before.
Right.
Oh, wait, Saeed. Damn, he's still
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Stay on.
We can take a
Okay.
picture.
We want to take a photo.
Oh.
wow.
Group.
Thank you.
I love it.
Come on, leadership.
Maybe you can help us too. Take a photo.
Come here.
Come join us.
Let me move this.
Okay, yes.
Okay, so we can stay here. Here. Don't put down here. Let's stay here. Okay.
It's not ready. It's gone.
Okay, you can come down. Down. Come down. Okay, let's just do this here. Okay, yeah.
Where was it?
University. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, yay!
I'm going to ask you. Awesome.
Yes.
I was like,